Dobbs was an attack on everybody, right? First of all, LGBTQ people need abortion healthcare. And also, of course, the Thomas concurrence flagged that, the threat to kind of the right to abortion is also, there's a threat to the right to equal marriage, the right to same-sex intimacy, kind of like there's a threat to, making decisions about our own lives, our own identity, our own well-being. And the attacks are really broad.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Spurlock. I'm the Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program, Gender Equality and Reproductive Rights After Dobbs. This is the fourth in a series which Ford Hall Forum has hosted since the Dobbs decision. And since then, with each passing day, we have seen further assaults on these hard-fought rights of gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and reproductive rights in the United States. This is an important conversation at a critical time, and we are so pleased that you are here with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank the sponsors for today's program. So we have the Communication Journalism Media Department at Suffolk University. We have the Women's and Gender Studies program at Suffolk. We have the Women's Our Bodies, Ourselves at Suffolk University today, the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights, of course, the GBH Forum Network, our longtime production partner, and the History, Language, and Culture Department at Suffolk. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the forum's sponsor, the Lowell Institute. Without their generous funding, we could not do programs like this one today. So it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's moderator, my colleague, Shoshana Madmoni-Gerber, who is the chair and associate professor in the journalism, communication, and I just switched that around, communication, journalism, and media department at Suffolk University. Shoshi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks everybody that participating with us today, our panelists and our audience. I'm honored to be part of this conversation. Since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in June of 2022, we have witnessed a rapid move to further restrict individual rights for bodily autonomy. Shortly after the court's decision, almost 1 in 3 women found themselves living in a state where abortion was unavailable or severely restricted. And within a year, the Human Rights Campaign documented over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in state legislation across the country, with over 200 targeting specifically transgender and non-binary people. Activists say this is a move that calls for a swift response. Last year, we engaged in 3 programs designed to examine this issue, focusing on how the court's decision was already affecting people's life on the ground. And today, we want to continue this discussion and examine the wider consequences of limiting people's bodily autonomy and access to healthcare. With us today are representatives from 3 important groups working on advocacy and care at the forefront of this issue. Together, we want to examine what we see as a simultaneous government overreach on core individual freedoms, an issue that's affecting all of us. Our panelists are Kristie Monast, Executive Director of HealthQ, Dallas Ducar, President and CEO of Transhealth, and Crozier, Director of Family Advocacy, GLBTQ Legal Advocates Defenders, or GLAD. I want a quick note just to say that Kristie will not appear on camera. Unfortunately, violence against abortion providers has been a reality for their work for over the past 50 years, and it has escalated since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. As a precautionary mechanism, Kristie, who has worked in abortion care since 1992 and personally knows people who have been targeted, has limited access to her image to protect herself and her loved one. We appreciate this, Kristie. And I actually want to start with you. In the last year, we have seen some evidence of further restriction on reproductive rights, and in some places even criminalizing travel for the abortion procedure out of state. Can you give us a short overview of where we are right now when it comes to navigating the reproductive care and sexual health? Have we regressed substantially since our last conversation a little over a year ago?
Thank you, Shoshi, for having me back, and Susan for hosting the program, and my colleagues for joining me on the panel. I do want to say that, yes, we have regressed some, and the last year has been difficult to endure for people trying to access care, for people who are working in care. I think that folks trying to access reproductive health care, and specifically abortion, don't know how to access it until they're trying, right? Like, it's not something that we're actually looking up or knowing who in our community are abortion providers or provide certain services until we know that we need them or somebody we know needs them. So first, just overcoming the myths and the misinformation that are out in the general universe for people to figure out abortion is legal where they are or is not legal where they are, and other care, such as gender-affirming hormone therapy and other care like that. So is it legal in your state? Who is providing it? Who is providing the actual service that you need? So if it's abortion, how far along are you in your pregnancy? And is that service available to you locally? There are a lot of people traveling around this country right now because they cannot access the services in their own communities. That has actually always been the case, yet it's worse that we are seeing folks leaving their states. There are significant media stories about folks in Texas who have left Texas to get abortion care, but that's happening in multiple states across the country, and people are traveling hundreds of miles, spending hundreds or thousands of dollars trying to access something that was actually available in their communities before the overturning of Roe. I just wanted to talk a little about what HealthQ does. We are a sexual and reproductive health care provider in northeastern Massachusetts. We have a mission that we provide care without judgment and without barriers. We have been around since 1971, serving folks from the North Shore and the Merrimack Valley. So we know the work that we do very intimately and the communities that we serve. We also serve folks from outside of our region. Like I said, we have 3 health centers. We are in Beverly, Haverhill, and Lawrence, Massachusetts. We do border New Hampshire, so we have routinely seen folks from out of our state just because we are a close resource to people in New Hampshire. We provide a lot of services in our health clinics, but we have expanded, especially because of the pandemic, to include telehealth services statewide in Massachusetts. I feel it's important for us to talk that we offer bilingual staff and interpreter services at our locations and via telehealth, because a lot of the communities we serve are English as a second language community or do not speak English at all. So we do have services built in where people can receive care in their preferred language or their language that they use routinely. And this is a list of the services that we do. We have offered abortion care services in our facility since 2016. We provide both medication and in-office aspiration procedures. So we go through the first trimester of pregnancy. We offer a wide range of sexual health services, as you can see, and they include things that maybe aren't typical in a family planning setting, like fertility consultations, ovulation induction. We offer sexual function and pleasure appointments to talk about what's working well or what's not working well for folks. We offer vasectomy services here, and we publicly changed to saying that we do gender affirming care because we started doing hormone therapy in also the late 2015-16 timeframe. And when the patients that were coming to us for hormone therapy requested laser hair removal services, we also added that. But I want to make it well known that we have offered all of the services as gender affirming care that you see on this page. And that's very important, that gender affirming care is not limited to just specific medical transition services. So she and I met, and I've been part of this panel now 2 times because of our connection to reproductive justice. Reproductive justice includes 4 tenets, and they are represented here: the right to have full autonomy over our bodies, the right to have or not have children, the right to birth and or parent our children with dignity, and the right to live and or raise a family in a safe, healthy environment. The conversation that we're having today and the previous seminars on this topic are really about what Shoshi has mentioned, this loss of autonomy that we've had, or the lack of access that people have had. I want to just point out that the laws that we've seen changing are decimating access for people who may have had access before, but there's always been a challenge for some communities to have access. So as we're really trying to do some legislative changes and some policy work, just to point out that having choice does not mean that we have access. So we have to keep pushing on both points. We have to make choice available, but we also have to keep working on access. Choice is not enough. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Shoshi, and just thank you on that last slide.
Yes, thank you very much. All are very important questions that we will get back to as we continue here. So the National Women's Law Center defines the movement of gender justice and reproductive rights rightfully as intersectional, stating that these movements work, and I quote, to ensure people of all genders can make their own decisions about their bodies and their future. This is especially alarming since both issues hinge on state interference and what should be a medical decision, a decision between an individual, maybe with a partner or parents, and their physician. And Dallas, can you tell us how you navigate the landscape of gender-affirming care as a director of and practitioner at Transhealth, and what are some of the challenges that you deal with and how they're connected to what Kristie just described?
Sure, yeah, and thank you very much for the question. You know, I think we've seen in general in healthcare that disinformation around science and healthcare has spread widely in the past couple of years. The COVID-19 pandemic was really a catalyst for questioning what role the state should play in healthcare, and quite rapidly, political pundits conflated their own opinion with facts. We saw conspiracy theories spread, and this really led to a dangerous precedent of conflating science with ideology, really in that everyone believing that they know what's best and can also dictate what is best for others. And the rise of these politically motivated facts has really quickly bled over from arguments about the efficacy of vaccination, a la COVID-19, to evidence around evidence-based gender-affirming care. And the truth is that the concept of gender is very complex. It's why whole fields of study are devoted to it. And gender-affirming healthcare really recognizes that complexity by emphasizing individual freedom and choice combined with comprehensive medical care. You know, what we see at Transhealth, which was founded in 2021, which I'm happy to also talk a little bit more about with some slides, but what we've seen is that individuals have fled from other states to Massachusetts at increasing rates, just trying to flee persecution and just trying to get access to care. And those are those individuals who are able to afford the movement across state lines. Many, many other individuals in many states, over 20 states now in the United States, ban best evidence gender-affirming care for youth. 2 states also make it very difficult for adults to be able to receive care too. And that is a dangerous precedent because we are now seeing the same tactics being used, similar tactics being used against children, frankly, and now targeting adult care too in different ways through administrative function. So, you know, what this means is that when you're starting a new healthcare center, which I would not recommend anyone start a healthcare center in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. But when you're doing that, and then you also have additional fear, right? When there have been bomb threats that have been levied against children's hospitals, when there are additional fears that this type of care that just wasn't politicized 5 or 6 years ago is now the target of so much scrutiny, where we have providers who might have panic attacks before going to work, when we have individuals who are practicing defensive medicine it takes a toll on the individual every single day. And it means that we, really have to ensure, and we are ensuring that we are providing the best care possible, and also ensuring that we are moving ahead in a way that is comprehensive in the care that we're providing, and making sure that we are not open to any potential spurious risk too in the process.
Yeah, and that's a very important point, because you kind of exposed another layer, because moving to Massachusetts isn't cheap by any stretch of the imagination from some of other places that are restricting these procedures. Polly, I want to turn it to you as somebody who engages with families, but also works on policy and advocacy. What are some of the challenges at the forefront of your work, and how do you see the connection between reproductive and LGBTQ rights, and especially the threat that it poses to teens and families?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for having us here. I will say that, I see the issues as really overlapping and interconnected in so many ways. And I would say, although it's been, of course, a very challenging few years, for me, one of the silver linings has been like the collaboration with the LGBTQ movement and the reproductive rights movement, and really, a way that we both recognize that, Dobbs was an attack on everybody, right? First of all, LGBTQ people need abortion healthcare. And also, of course, the Thomas concurrence flagged that, the threat to kind of the right to abortion is also, there's a threat to the right to equal marriage, the right to same-sex intimacy, kind of like there's a threat to, making decisions about our own lives, our own identity, our own well-being. And the attacks are really broad. They're really broad. They don't stop at abortion. Of course, we've seen in the past year and a half, 24 states ban access to gender-affirming care for transgender youth, right? That is a tremendous escalation in attacks on transgender healthcare, which not only bans healthcare for minors and some adults in states, but really has sent a chilling effect through healthcare, right? Even in states where healthcare has not been banned, we are seeing restrictions on healthcare. And we are seeing providers, as Dallas said, leaving the healthcare practice, not moving to states where there are unfavorable bans. Like, it's really had a tremendous impact on access to care. And of course, I feel like Dobbs just kind of lit a fire under so many attacks on transgender people and LGBTQ people, right? Because it's not only healthcare, it's also attacks on what's being taught in schools, right? The proliferation of anti-CRT and and book bans and whatnot. It is an attack on LGBTQ families through attacks on IVF, right? It is, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about the Alabama case in a while. So I would say GLAAD is, we are working on many fronts, like really shoulder to shoulder with other movements to, first of all, let's try to stop any more LGBTQ bans happening in state legislatures and federally, of course, in any way, shape, or form, because you put together all of these attacks on transgender people, and they're really trying to silence people. They're really trying to, it's not beyond healthcare, right? They're really trying to shut down such a phenomenal part of our community and our brothers and sisters and community members. And so we're trying to stop, we're on defense in the legislatures, and we are challenging the bans in court, right? One of my colleagues is challenging the care ban in Alabama and in Florida. And we're also trying to move forward, right? And we're moving forward in a way, like we're trying to pass laws to shield access to healthcare and to shield providers of healthcare in states where the care is legal, right? To not only send the signal that, folks, you can get healthcare, and we value healthcare, we value science in these communities. And whether you're in that community or you're coming from elsewhere and you need that healthcare, we are now up to 17 states with shield laws, and we're working to pass more. So, and of course, I really appreciate that Kristie also talked about how reproductive justice really means so much more beyond abortion as well, because a lot of GLAAD's work is also about the right to have children and the right to raise children in an environment that is safe and healthy, right? Which is a lot of our work addresses access to parentage protections and making sure that every child has the security of a legal parent-child relationship, because we have a patchwork of protections across the country. So I will say, I guess, just to summarize, like, we are, of course, working throughout the country post Dobbs to protect LGBTQ people really broadly. And I think that, Dobbs just kind of really kind of changed the tone and the urgency of the work in a tremendous way.
Yeah, and it's good to know that there is a coalition of groups,
Yeah.
and we've seen that, because I think that that is the way to fight this level of attack. And I will just note that in the United States, the complexity of how healthcare is delivered here, which is so different from how it's done in other Western countries, it's tied to your job. There are
Right.
all kinds of layers and opportunities to create to continue to create barriers. And you all kind of touched on the way, I really appreciated on the way that this is talked about, which is really important. And that leads me to my next question. As a media scholar and a former journalist, I always pay attention to the media discourse. And Dallas, you were so right about how it unfolded with the effects of COVID. And of course, the effects of social media is kind of really lighting everything on fire. So I see that often the public discourse in the media, in some media outlets, of course not all media outlets, but also by politicians, is dominated by a distortion of the depiction of like the main concept, even if I just think about what is abortion. So not even realize that, if you have a miscarriage and you need a D&C, guess what? That's another procedure, right, that is related. What is gender affirming care really? And who are the individuals seeking these procedures? So I'm wondering if you can help kind of clarify a little bit what do you see as a misconception, or offer like a more useful framework for this discussion?
I would, first off, just start by saying that, just echoing what Polly said and Kristie said too, that this is an attack on liberty. It's an attack on freedom. It's an attack on core American values. And I think that's one thing that doesn't translate all the time, and especially in the media, that when you are attacking someone's pursuit of happiness, you are attacking a core American value. What's also very true here is that trans people, like myself, I'm openly trans, we're not numerous in a population demographic, right? At least not out in that way. And so what that means is, for many people, they don't actually know that they have met a trans person. And there's a large group of individuals, which some pollsters will call the movable middle, which are people who just don't know that they have yet met a trans person. And because of that, lots of different, whether it's conspiracy theories, whether it's just disinformation or misinformation on social media or on TV, these lies really can spread, and misinformation, disinformation around what a trans person is. And so one of the most important things that we can do is also share narrative stories.
Yes.
Be able to help people understand that, trans people can be your nurse, your doctor, your attorney, your firefighter. And that's because trans people are human beings like anyone else, right? And so it's when you start with those narratives, when you start also by really introducing the shared value language, that can be really, really powerful. Going back to COVID-19, we knew that, trying to convince people to get vaccinated, well, science wasn't going to do that. Facts wasn't going to do that, right? It was telling stories that did it. It was appealing to emotion. And in the same way, presenting lenses that are, emotionally valent, and that be able to tell others that, we are here and we are not necessarily, we're not going away, right? And we need healthcare like anyone else. That's really a starting place right there.
That's great. Thank you. Polly or Kristie? Yep.
Well, that's first of all, I agree so much. And I would say that, unfortunately, I have seen in the last 2 years really an increase in disinformation, and really the need for it. It's not only, I totally agree in terms of personal experience and just like the reminder of the common humanity of everyone, and of reaching across difference and trying to understand your fellow person. But also, I think it's a challenge for all of our movements to get the right information out there and make sure people have the right information, right? Like, for example, when we're passing shield laws, making sure people really understand, which Dallas can speak to better than I can, but that transgender healthcare is individualized, standard of care, best practice healthcare. It is complicated and nuanced, just like any other type of healthcare. And the providers of it are doing it with excellence and with care to that individual and that individual's needs. Like there's, and it's backed by, science and careful study. And I think that there's really a need to get good information out there and to remind people how to get good information, right? Because I think so much of what's happening now is a little bit of a war on truth, right? And we have to be sure that we are putting forth good resources, and all of us, right? And that we're really doing our homework and making sure people understand, what's really at stake. And something you said, Shoshi, which I think is also really important, is it's come up in my work, just this week, which is that I do a lot of work in the family building realm, right? I do a lot of work about access to fertility healthcare, family building, and how much abortion is a part of family building healthcare.
Yeah.
And it is, you cannot do IVF, you cannot, support people through infertility struggles without discussing and engaging with abortion. And so I think it is just a reminder, right, that the need for science, the need for good information, and the need to remember that we're all people on a journey, and rather than putting folks into, various boxes and moving away from kind of extremist language.
Right, exactly. And I think, Kristie, you mentioned it in the last conversation, that notion that women are running around just having abortion for the fun of it. It's I think you gave the statistics last time that it's mostly women who already have children, who are in family structures and so on. So really the decisions are nuanced and they're different from one person to the next. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Kristie?
I do, and thank you for bringing that up, right? Like the people who are perceived, right, or this image that we create of who is accessing abortion care, or focusing right now on gender affirming care and minors, right? That all of a sudden all these children are either being forced to or wanting to change their gender. And sticking with science and sticking with facts is so important. It was one of the things that I know, Shoshi, when I presented, right, that the majority of our people are parents. 2% of people accessing abortion care in the state of Massachusetts are minors. But we talk about abortion care like it's mostly minors who have never had a pregnancy prior, right?
Right.
The one thing I did want to add, I was thinking about, as a sexuality educator and doing work in this realm for over 30 years, the change that we've seen in the 30 years, and yet the not change, right? Like we're sort of sliding backwards, but are we really? It's just that there's this push of, we don't want to talk about sexuality, or we create something to be afraid of in a culture where the structure in which our society was built is being challenged. And we're not giving people information to know their bodies, to know how they work, to know how families start, to know how medical care is delivered, right? So we're working on the fears to basically turn people into supporting an ideology that, what Dallas said was so beautiful, is an attack on a value of our country, is the pursuit of happiness. Right. And I was thinking about how and Dallas said that too, being transgender is not new, right? Transgender folks have existed forever, but we are now at a time with social media, after a pandemic, where people are like, to hell with it, I am going to live my life the way I want to, and I feel more comfortable, or there's something in my community to live more authentically. To build my family the way that I want to. Reproductive justice and the pursuit of it is not quite close to being achieved, but people want to get there, right? So we're trying to move there, but with resistance from people who see that as a threat to an ideology that they're holding on to.
And of course, when religion is also invoked, then it's like a completely different territory where that requires also to be to be addressed. So I wanted to talk about, you always have such great topics, and the issue of misinformation and disinformation is, of course, so we see now what's at stake. You know, we're talking about democracy and election, and it's a really crucial and something that's at the forefront of communication scholars. How do we fight with that? And it's not that I have a magic bullet. I think everybody should study media literacy. But it's not really a magic solution. But I'm wondering, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what the media is doing right. And Dallas, you so nicely framed it, is talking about narratives and people's stories. And what I thought was so useful is that when we put a face on the legislation or the restriction, and all of a sudden we noticed what it did on the ground. So we heard about, you know, the women in Georgia, Texas, and other places that nearly died because they couldn't get medical attention soon enough. And last year, the 10-year-old girl in Ohio that was raped and needed to travel across state line to seek medical care. So I wanted to ask you if you could share a little bit, if you have stories or a narrative or an example that you think you can share with us about how it's affecting people's life on the ground.
I'll try to keep this very brief too, because I'm sure everyone has these stories. But there was just a couple weeks ago, there was a young pediatric patient who had come into Transhealth. This patient had come in from across state lines because this patient wasn't able to get care where she was from, and the patient, after receiving care, wanted, which is constitutionally protected in Massachusetts, then wanted to come upstairs to be able to just meet me for a moment and just know that that it could be possible to be trans and a CEO in this world today. And she just had no conceptualization of this until she got to sit down and meet me. And what did we talk about? We talked about her favorite sport, which was soccer, and her favorite class, which was recess. There was nothing about trans stuff that we talked about at all, right? It was just being human and having your identity, you know, being able to see yourself reflected in the experience of another, right? And so that's a story of a really, really just easy intervention, right? It's just being able to be yourself. There's many other stories I could tell where people did not receive the right healthcare at the right time, and they died. Many patients that I have seen come through different healthcare systems across the country have died because they have not been afforded access to very basic healthcare. And what I will also just say here too is that I think the media oftentimes focuses on gender affirming healthcare being a hormone or being a surgery or being some intervention. But so much of gender affirming healthcare is actually not necessarily that, right? It's how you're receiving that care. It's the approach. Is it being done with informed consent? Is it being done in a trauma-informed way? Is it being done in a way that really understands and is curious about your identity, which so much of healthcare these days tries to fit people into boxes, right? And rush you out of the appointment. And gender affirming care tries to do exactly the opposite, not put you into a box, and instead say, we're going to care for you as your whole self. And that starts in so many different areas, not just in the treatment, but in the approach, in the philosophy, in being able to sit down with that little girl and talk about her favorite class.
That's great. Polly, I've seen, I think that in January, NPR had a piece about families that were packing up and leaving with their kids, and this was mentioned before. So I'm wondering if you came across anything like that or any story in this space that you wanted to share.
I've met some of those folks. I think there are folks who had made the difficult decision to leave their homes and their communities and move to a state where they can access healthcare. which is, as Dallas said, it is really beyond healthcare. It's like can access like the freedom to go to the bathroom, like at school. Like, I mean, there's a use their pronouns at school. I mean,
Yeah.
some of the restrictions in some of these states are so draconian. It's really hard to imagine. You know, people they're super resilient, but it's a difficult environment. I met one family who half the family came to Massachusetts because the transgender child and one of their parents came to Massachusetts, and then the rest stayed in their home state, right? I think
Wow.
there are, so they made that difficult decision to
Yeah.
split the family up
Wow.
because of access to healthcare and safety for the transgender child. So I think, unfortunately, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of stories out there. I mean, I was at a hearing last week in a state in New England, and one of the local advocates, transgender advocates, who's really done wonderful work going to school committees, right? Which someone asked a question in the chat, I think, about what local folks can do. And, you know, this particular person, you know, really has taken it upon himself to go to school committee meetings and to be a presence of, you know, to be for questioning and to really bring some kind of understanding in the room and some structure in conversations that can be really challenging. And this community member has been now the subject of FOIA requests, right? To various public agencies, just because he's a community member who cares and knows and is knowledgeable and is showing up. So I think that unfortunately, you know, I think there are a lot of stories out there of people making difficult choices, of people being, you know, intimidated into silence. But there's also so many fantastic stories out there as well. And one of the things I would say that concerns me a little bit about the media, sorry, media professor,
Yeah. No.
is the danger. There is a little bit of the danger of the single story happening, right? And there is a little bit of sometimes the media really wants to hear the scary, sad, horrible stories, when what we want to share is the positive, wonderful stories and why things are going well. Right? Because we want to lead folks down a path of, here's a community that's doing it well. Here's a law that is making really positive change.
Yeah.
And it is very hard to get those stories placed. It is very hard to rise above a single story kind of narrative.
Yeah.
So anyway, I would just say, I think I really value people in our community who are still sharing their stories, because I think a lot of them are feeling really nervous about doing that. And so for the people who feel brave enough, thank you so much. And also media, like particularly when it's a story that suggests rights should be taken away, right? Like I've heard a lot of misinformation, banana stories that are not real, you know, really look beyond the surface and figure out what the big picture is.
Yeah. And there is no simple formula, you know, only do individual story, or you need to go into it with the right motivation, that wants to talk about policy, that talks about the different layers and stress different stories. So there is no just one thing to do. And Kristie, I see your hand, and I was going to add to you, because of the nature of the services that HealthQ provides, and you've mentioned it before, if you can add a little bit about it from the perspective of intersectionality. How do people in marginalized communities, undocumented migrants, what are some of the added layers that you can talk about?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, and Shoshi, if I forget to touch on that one specific point, I do want to go back to what Polly was saying, you know, just a little piece of that media, which should tie in all this in, is the one story, right, the happy story or the sad story, if it just comes from one angle, is also very limiting. There was a recent show, I believe it was a Diane Sawyer show, that showed all of these folks in Texas who had been impacted by the law changes there and their inability, who had wanted pregnancies but weren't able to continue them and had abortions or loss. And my sister was texting me. I've been doing this work, you said, for over 30 years. My sister was texting me while the show was on and was like, oh my gosh, I never got it until now, what you've been talking about that you do for work, right?
Yeah.
And that was huge for me, as having a family that isn't necessarily supportive of what I do for work. But then the other piece of that was, it showed from all angles. It showed their partners and how they were involved and how they had feelings and how they were impacted in their lives by the laws, or how I just never thought this would happen to me.
Right.
connection to them. So tying back to your question that, how does this impact me for people who are in marginalized communities? And I'm thinking specifically of migrant communities, which we are serving with at HealthQ, understanding our healthcare system first in general, understanding our legal system. Do they have insurance or not have insurance? Do they have something that speaks with them in their language? I actually went to a healthcare provider that's not ours this morning for my own personal life, and I saw that they had a bunch of different documents and a bunch of different, the same document in a bunch of different languages, but it had their language in English. I was like, well, how do they find which sheet to pull? Because we're saying their language in English. It should say it in whatever their language is,
Yeah.
right? So how do we help people navigate our systems is part of that. And how do we help them with the access to, right? So if we have folks in Massachusetts, for instance, I hear a lot that we have such a advantage being in this state. We do have a
Yeah.
high insurance rate of patients as providers, but there are folks who, as migrants, get Mass Health Limited, which is an insurance that's only for catastrophic use. But something as an unwanted, unplanned pregnancy that may change the course of their entire future could be seen as an emergency, but is not covered under that insurance, right? Or a
Right.
life-saving care, such as hormone therapy or something that they might have to discontinue because it's not covered by their insurance and they can't afford it out of pocket. So I hope I tied
Right.
back to answer your
Yeah.
question, how those things impact the intersectionality of it.
Thank you. And yeah, of course, you illustrated it very well. So I wanted to ask Andrew to insert the map for a minute, because I want to ask you a little bit about the tension between the local and the national bans. I know that kind of despite maybe are not entirely justified sense of security because we're living in Massachusetts, but you can see on the map that we are not in the most protective category. So there are some issues here as well. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how is that the different restrictions in other places are affecting the work that you do. And I'll start with you, Polly. Specifically, I know that you're helping and working on the IVF case in Alabama. If you can talk a little bit about what do you do there?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, I think, let me just kind of give everybody a baseline of what happened in Alabama on February 16th of this year, which is the Alabama Supreme Court in an action involving a wrongful death case and wrongful death action. The court effectively declared that embryos that were frozen and created in the process of fertility healthcare, in the process of IVF, that they were legal children. And so that their accidental destruction could be the source of a wrongful death action. And of course, just of course want to say extremely sympathetic to the hopeful parents who, were very much hoping to use those embryos in their family building process. But the court's legal declaration of frozen embryos that are essentially cryogenically stored for later use in IVF as legal children was really a stunning kind of new development in what we're seeing, which is like the further restriction on reproductive rights, right? It is moving from abortion to what we call personhood, right? And I think that some, I have in the work that I do have really, come to understand how in some respects, IVF is more disliked because of the number of embryos it creates. And if you think that if your worldview is that embryos are people, IVF, in fact, through the process of IVF just, unfortunately requires the destruction of various embryos in certain ways, that it is seen as quite harmful. So that case, I think, was just a shock to the system because so many people access fertility healthcare, so many people need it. It is really kind of understood generationally from parents to grandparents to children as like a kind of healthcare that is so incredibly needed because 1 in 6 people in this country have infertility. And then of course, there's many other folks who need fertility healthcare to build their families. So I think that was really like a stunning moment in my work because We hadn't before seen those kinds of restrictions. And I think one of the hopeful pieces about that was, I think so many people thought, golly, we've gone too far with this case, that this is really, we have to really be careful and not go any farther. But of course, I think, you know, once we're past the sound bites, we haven't seen the action that we need to make that a reality. Like, for example, you know, I was helping some folks on the ground try to craft legislation in Alabama to try to get the healthcare system back underway, because I forgot to say that that Supreme Court ruling effectively shut down fertility healthcare in Alabama within a week, because the clinics could no longer operate because of the ruling. And the legislative fix didn't actually solve the problem, right? Embryos are still categorized as legal children, unfortunately, and patients are not protected in their ability to do fertility health care. And all the fix did was essentially change the liability laws for providers, and in fact took away any malpractice claims from patients whatsoever. Right. So the fix was not a fix, which is just a way to say we are really seeing in the work that I do on access. I do, you know, work to expand access to fertility healthcare, right, including Medicaid, because really and I love Kristie's point about access, because in fact, no state comprehensively provides access to family building healthcare to anyone on Medicaid, right? So I do work to expand access to fertility healthcare, to protect children born through assisted reproduction and surrogacy, because we need to make sure they are secure. And I think we are seeing a kind of new phase in the anti-abortion movement to really, go after, unfortunately, fertility healthcare, and all the families and people who rely on fertility healthcare.
So yeah, you described it beautifully, because there is kind of a feeling that whatever you're trying to do, there is another way that's coming at it. And of course, I wanted Kristie, if you can kind of tell us a little bit in regards to mifepristone case that is right now before the Supreme Court, because I believe that from what I've seen, 2/3 of all abortions are now done through the abortion medication. So really, what's at stake here?
Yeah, and it's true. It's about 60% of abortions right now are through medication abortion. The background is that the lawsuit, which was filed by anti-abortion advocates against the FDA and the U.S. Health and Human Services in November of 2022, challenges the FDA's initial approval of mifepristone, as well as its more recent actions to increase access to the medication mifepristone, which is one of 2 medications used in a medication abortion. The Supreme Court heard the case or arguments last Tuesday. The Supreme Court's review is limited to 2 major questions: whether the plaintiffs have standing to bring the case, and whether the FDA's 2016 and 2021 actions to revise what we call the REMS and other conditions were arbitrary and capricious. They are now reviewing the FDA's initial approval of mifepristone in the year 2000, or they are not doing that, nor are they challenging or looking at the original claim that the FDA's actions violated the Comstock Act.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things we've been hearing in the media, but just to lay out what they are really looking at. Regarding the arbitrary and capricious, Congress has authorized the FDA to review and approve drugs. At issue in this case is the standard by which the FDA may alter those conditions for use. And again, this REMS word that we hear is setting some extra rules and regulations around how they can approve medications and have people who are dispensing them do that. There have been many amicus briefs or friends of the court briefs to show basically that the regulatory process that the FDA has used is in good standing order. So the Supreme Court is specifically reviewing the rules that allow them to access mifepristone via telehealth. This is to answer your question, like what could change? Because of the 2011 or 2016 and 2021 actions, telehealth medication abortion is more easily accessed and is actually available. So they're looking at whether or not that can stand, and whether or not the FDA basically can approve and change some of how they approve things.
So I mean, it feels like it's a lot. There's a lot at stake here. if something where, you know, if a decision like that would stop the ability of providers to prescribe, because it was overcoming the fact that in some places there are so many restrictions that women cannot get access to care except through the pill that is prescribed to them and delivered through the mail, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where we will see access limited, abortion and medication abortion will not go away. It
Mhm.
may go away via telehealth, and it may go away for a certain gestational age. So we can now do abortions up until the end of the 10th week. Before 2016, it was only up until the end of the 7th week. So it may change how far along in a pregnancy somebody could be and whether or not they can access it by telehealth. The other thing that people should be totally alarmed by, and to a lot of what Polly has been sharing, is it's so much bigger than just abortion. And people aren't necessarily chatting about that in the discourse. So the case raises the question about the role of the courts in reviewing the FDA's determinations about a particular drug. And this could impact so many other things in care going forward on how this ruling turns out.
I wanted to ask all of you in Dallas, you can start this time, just thinking about the kind of competing trends that we are witnessing. So on the one hand, actually abortions, because I looked at the data, it didn't go down since overturning. So it stayed about the same. And I don't know if it's because the places that allow for it kind of increased the possibilities. And we've seen the good news is that whenever it came on the ballots, so voters clearly said, we want safe and accessible abortion in the state where we live. And we've just witnessed this yesterday with Florida, right? On the one hand, the court's handing this decision that will let the six-week ban go into effect in a month, but they were allowing the ballot question, and maybe it will be following the election protected in the state's constitution. So can you help us in short kind of understand how to make sense of these conflicting trends?
Sure. You know, I think the trend that you're speaking to is that there's more government ban of healthcare that is occurring now more than ever. And at the same time, we're seeing that some of the access in some areas has increased. What I would say, though, is that the access, at least in the gender affirming care world, has not increased substantially in that way. You know, if there's one thing that is true that all of the research shows, it is that there is not enough access to gender affirming healthcare in this country. And that the myth that people are just being put through some assembly line and just, you know, coming into a doctor's office and getting some hormones, it's just not true. I mean, think about how long it takes to just get a primary care appointment, right? And just your own primary care appointment or your own mental health provider, right? It's not easy to do. And so now you're taking that and you're putting it in a very subspecialty area in a place that's not technically even considered a subspecialty. And it makes it, you know, it makes it difficult to access that care, right? Because there's so few people with good competency around providing this care. The other difference between reproductive health care and, say, gender affirming healthcare is that gender affirming healthcare is generally a lifelong, you know, relationship with the provider. It's not you're going somewhere for one procedure generally and you're done forever.
A great point, Dallas.
You are continuously connected to that provider many times, so your body can actually have hormones to live, right? And so when you are without hormones, for example, your body can literally shut down if you don't have the right hormones. And so the important thing to note here is that the access trends will not look the same in the gender affirming care world. And especially as we are seeing a more accepting environment with more, generally, with more children who are able and brave enough to be able to come out, or adults who are brave enough to be able to come out and to be able to be their own self. At the same time, we're also seeing that the access is not responding accordingly. And especially for those states where care might be banned, the access is just non-existent. So, you know, our mission is pretty simple here. We are located in Western Massachusetts, but we do provide care to folks across Massachusetts. We want to support and empower trans and gender diverse individuals. And we really want to acknowledge the fact that throughout history as a community, trans and gender diverse people have looked to each other for healing, support, and affirmation. And so we really try to honor that by really serving as that source of hope. We really try to center, again, the hopeful vision that is here around the ability for anyone to be able to be themselves. And while we have talked a lot about clinical care here at Transhealth, we also are committed to research, to advocacy, to education, and we have a robust community department as well. And a lot of what we provide is not just in the confines of, primary care and mental health. It's not what your insurer necessarily will dictate. We've had farm shares here before, yoga classes, workout classes, theater groups, and then many other community groups that are not necessarily clinical in nature, along with the advocacy research and education we do, trying to really push the needle. And, I said that gender affirming care is not always, it's not necessarily medications or hormones or surgery. This is what one patient said made their experience so special. We were nice, we had so much fun stuff, and we rocked. And that's what we're also talking about here. It's just good healthcare, right? That might not even be related to gender. Or what this patient wrote here, where they were able to feel whole for the first time, right? I mean, it's very basic interventions. And really what we know is healthcare pathologizes bodies and identities. And instead we're trying to create something that's different, that's trauma-informed, that allows for life wellness and puts the individual in the driver's seat. And just to note that we have seen, as we've talked about on this webinar already, disinformation run rampant, right? And there is a through line between disinformation to vilification to ostracization, legislation, and violence, right? So one of the most important things we can do is combat disinformation. The more we work to do that, the more we can help stop the trend towards some of the terrible legislation we're seeing or the violence that we're seeing too. And just to show one other map here, this is the legislative map for youth in the United States. This was compiled by a journalist named Aaron Reed. It has the areas that might have the highest anti-trans legislation risk. And you can see it's not good. This is not a nice map to look at, right? We are seeing that the anti-trans legislation has spread like wildfire in the past couple of years, especially against youth. And then this is for adults here, where it still is getting bad, and we predict it will get worse too. And we have seen now that the anti-trans talking points have been elevated to the core parts of the GOP's platform now too. So this is really becoming a way to, unfortunately, to garner votes and really play with people's lives and harm people. And so, at Transhealth, we really believe we can be one of many partners who's working to really, push the needle in the other way, and doing that through the direct care that we provide and then many other activities that we're committed to.
Thank you, Dallas. This was really informative and very helpful in understanding and striking how the overlap that we've seen in both maps. Okay, I'm going to turn it to audience questions, and we'll get to as much as we can. How do people accept health insurance at HealthQ? Audience member is asking for a friend who is originally from Massachusetts, but have been forced to move to Florida with her family. She would be interested in, procedure, laser hair removal.
Thank you. I'm going to answer your question, I promise, but also to make the point of one of the intersectionalities and a problem with healthcare is a lot of folks don't understand insurance either, right? Like if we tout like people have insurance coverage, we still may not know how to utilize that. So to answer to the question, I think every healthcare provider basically will have contracts with certain insurance providers. You are either considered in-network or out-of-network. It's important to check with your insurance company what they cover, so you sort of have an idea of what is covered with your insurance policy. to know what your co-pays and your deductible expectations are. At HealthQ, we actually will help people do that. We do insurance verifications so that we'll talk with the insurance companies and learn a lot of that information and then communicate with our patients about whether or not the services that we are looking to offer them are covered, what their out-of-pocket expenses would be. And also just to let folks know that there is legal legislation right now requiring healthcare providers to give good faith estimates of costs of your medical care. And that is something that we are complying with here as well, so that people will know when scheduling an appointment if something is covered, if it's not, what their out-of-pocket expense would be. We also, for people who are uninsured or who have things that are not covered by their insurance policies, will offer sliding fee scale discounts if people qualify for that. So get in touch with us if you're interested.
That's good to know. And I have to mention this because it's so baffling to me. I'm coming from a country with socialized medicine, and to always witness again and again these layers of obstacles in just figuring out how to navigate the healthcare and who accepts it and who doesn't. So the other question, we got a couple of variation of this question. This type of presentation are always so informative, but as someone who's very angry and frustrated, I'd also love to hear what people like me can do to help to get things to a level of sanity and humanity.
Thanks so much for that question. I love the question of oriented to action. That's fantastic. I mean, I'm sure other folks have thoughts on this, but I will truly make a pitch for getting involved in your state legislative processes. I would say there is a lot of good things happening in state legislatures. And even if you're in a difficult state, your voice tremendously matters. Meeting with your state representative and your state senator, understanding what are the issues and bills that are coming up before your state legislature, submitting testimony, telling your story if you connect to that issue. That, state representatives in particular, they represent a relatively small number of people. They really want to hear from their constituents. And you can really impact change in the state legislature in a powerful way. So I would say get involved in your state legislature. Also, same goes with your local school committee, right? To stay abreast of like what's happening in terms of diversity efforts, what's happening in terms of sex education. How can you be a positive voice for making sure children in your community are getting all the information that they need? And finally, I will say, if there's some issue that's close to your heart, right, like reproductive health care, abortion access or whatnot, there are often grassroots groups who are doing really wonderful things, whether that's community support or, doing policy work. I just got back from signing of the Michigan Family Protection Act, where I helped to draft the law. But the real engine of that law was a grassroots group that was founded in 2019 because a woman, a grassroots group that founded in 2019. And it's just a group of, it is a group of volunteers who have full-time jobs and lots to do. And they got together because they saw a law, that a ban on surrogacy that they wanted to change, and they worked really hard to make it happen. So I would just say, I think the individual, you have a lot of power to do really tremendous things in your community.
That's great. And I have something that related also to action. What are some of the best way to support poor and Black and Indigenous and people of color in getting the care that they require and deserve, especially in states where services are limited or restricted?
I was actually going back to the previous question,
Okay.
to this question too, but I'll just say, for the previous question, also just when you get if you're on an airplane, for example, don't just put your headphones in immediately, right? If you're at a bar or a diner, don't be afraid to saddle up next to somebody who's a stranger and talk to them. One of the things that we really don't do a lot because of cell phones in our hands at all times is we don't actually talk to people that are outside of our networks. And algorithms, social media algorithms, incentivize us to get information that confirms what we think we already know. And having lived in states like Arizona or Virginia, one of my favorite things to do was to saddle up next to a stranger and talk to them about gender-affirming healthcare, and just begin to start the conversation, because so many people aren't even exposed to very basic narratives, and you can really go a long way in just talking with strangers. And it's not the end of the world. So that's just one other recommendation I
Yeah.
have, especially if you're not someone that necessarily feels equipped to do the advocacy component at this moment. Everyone can still do something by talking to others. In terms of trying to ensure that QT BIPOC individuals or queer and trans people of color are able to get the care that they need, one organization I just want to really uplift is the Campaign for Southern Equality. And they have been working hard to ensure that people, especially LGBTQ people in the South, are able to get access to care. There's a lot of great nonprofits that are in the South that have been doing this work for a while and continue to do this work. And I would just really recommend looking them up. And then, there's amazing organizations that direct, even just getting some direct funding can really go a long way for some smaller organizations. And so, I think for many, many folks, it is relying on some of those organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, including other organizations who have been helping people to relocate too.
Kristie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have just a couple of additions. I'm thinking that for some of the what can you do, love everything Polly and Dallas shared. So yes, if that's what you have capacity for. If that's not what you have capacity for, I think if you can do something little like donate and support organizations, and I'm talking little, like if it's $1, if it's $5, whatever you can, to organizations that are helping folks access care. So things like National Network of Abortion Funds, if you look them up, there may be a local abortion fund to you that you would want to support, or maybe to an abortion fund that specifically targets the communities that you're looking to support. Like somebody was asking about BIPOC or Indigenous communities. Post-abortion bags I just wrote down because we have a community of synagogues across the state of Massachusetts that they were like, we don't know what to do. So they came together and they're gathering the resources through donations of things to put into bags for our patients. So after they access abortion care services, we give them this bag that was put together by volunteers through their donations. And it has menstrual pads, it has heat packs to help them with cramps, it has hand lotion and water bottles, tea, chocolates, things to make them just feel cared for. And people are traveling. So if there's things that you can do to support the people that are traveling as well, and maybe the National Network of Abortion Funds would be an option for that. I think I just went to an event on Saturday night and heard that this community, which was in Vermont, had nowhere that was supporting the LGBT community to have their events. They had one location where the owner was willing to donate or lend out their space. So if you have space that you could have donated to people to hold events or gather as groups, that could be helpful. There's always something that you have in your world that you can connect to somebody else's. And then the other organization I wanted to mention was Sister Song, which is doing a lot of, they are really, the starters or the handlers after the folks who started reproductive justice movement, and they're based out of Atlanta, are doing a lot of work right now and focus a lot on BIPOC community. And the Abortion Care Network works with independent abortion providing health organizations across the country. And a lot of the states that don't have a lot of access but still have access to abortion care only have independent abortion care providers. They don't have a Planned Parenthood. They may not even have a hospital that does abortion care. So they have something called Keep Our Clinics, which is a fundraising campaign, and just to help them keep going. And even some of the ones that are not offering abortions right now, but trying to hang on and offer other services to their communities as long as they can, could use your support.
Thank you. I have one quick comment and a really good question to all of you. So the comment is from an audience member that wanted to note that over 20 years ago, two families were connected because they needed to utilize puberty blockers for their daughters. Absolutely, this is healthcare and should be universally available. Thank you for this conversation. And a good question to all of you. How do you prioritize how you as a provider prioritize your own physical and mental well-being? And do you have any advice for people who are getting started in this field on how to avoid a burnout before they can really get started?
That is hard.
Yeah.
I respect my panelists so much, and I was thinking that earlier after Dallas's slides, like how much we give and dedicate, and learning how to do self-care is really hard, no matter where we are working in this movement. And I think what I can afford to folks, I've been doing this for 30 years, is you have to have some people around you who really support you. You have to have something that you know that you love outside of the work, and find some time to commit to engaging in it, even if it's going outside for a walk. And maybe you do that every day. Maybe you do it once a week, but you give yourself something to look forward to. The other thing I wanted to point out is vicarious trauma is real, right? And we deal with, troubleshoot, try to overcome a lot of what is happening with other people to help them get the most of what they can out of whatever we're offering, right? So for me, it's healthcare. We have to have a way to diffuse that and not take that all on, but get that somewhat out and know that you've done a good deed, or that you've tried your best, and process it somehow so that you can keep going, because you will get burned out if you don't have a diffusing mechanism.
Thank you. Did anybody wanted to add? Dallas? Yeah.
Yeah, I will just also add that, I mean, to be very real, there are some days where like you might not be able to really care for yourself fully in the way that you want, right? Because this is hard work and these are unprecedented times. And so I think just level setting there and saying that, you know, especially in healthcare, it's always changing. And then when you add all of this other stuff with it too, it makes for a really difficult environment at times. And so I totally echo what Kristie's saying about having something that's outside of this work that draws you into that. Also having the people that can really keep you in check in a lot of ways, and you know, help you understand when you might not be doing so well and can call you in that way. I think that's when a high functioning team is really, really essential. You know, there's no such thing as high performance in a vacuum, right?
Right.
You can only do well if you're also surrounded with a team that's also doing really well too. So really having a strong team in this work, allies in this work, people that are in other organizations that you can count on. The amount of folks at GLAAD that I lean on deeply, you know, amazing organization. And it feels like we are in this together. And that experience of not being alone somewhere, especially now when our country faces a loneliness epidemic, is critical. And then just make sure you get some sleep, make sure you eat, make sure if you have a dog, you hug your dog, and you make sure that you are able to say no when you can, because it's so easy to keep saying yes to so many things, and you will burn yourself out if you're not saying yes to yourself.
So we need to wrap it up, and I will add just one more, and I'll turn it to you, Polly. And again, if anybody wants just one sentence, I was going to ask, how should we think about this and remain hopeful? But I already feel so hopeful just witnessing you and listening to you. So, Polly.
There's so many phenomenal people who are out there who care about reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, trans rights, and who are in this work and doing the work. And I connect with them frequently, and like that keeps me going. I just think there's so many wonderful people in the world and so many people who want to learn more. So I don't know. I'm feeling it's a very difficult moment, but very hopeful about our power for positive change.
Great. Yes, so and on this note, I want to thank you all so much for sharing your expertise, your experience, your work, your knowledge. with us. This was an amazing conversation, and I could see from the reaction from our audience that they were moved and touched and encouraged and inspired. So thank you all very much for this important work that you do and for being with us this afternoon. The bios are here again, so if you want more information about any of the organizations, please proceed and you can email our guests. Thank you and be well.